different. I'm very concerned about the Germans releasing these Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians, because that could be the proverbial Rubicon and result in our Oreshniks landing in various places in Germany. So the Ukrainian fight pointed out that they've already lost 10,000 men fighting for Ukraine inside Ukraine. All of this is a lot of bluster and nonsense. And that's why I sent you something that Chris Hedges read on his program, which was a leaflet from the IDF. And it made it very clear that the people in Gaza and eventually, I think, on the West Bank have a choice. We're moving ammunition. We're moving weapon systems into the region, into the Eastern Mediterranean, into the Red Sea, and probably, I don't know much about the Indian Ocean. I can't comment on that, but we know those things have happened. We know that we have at least 2 batteries of theater high altitude air defense missiles. What will actually bring it off? And then we have Iran looming on the horizon as the next major target for Mr. Netanyahu.
I think there are superficial preparations. The most significant ones, of course, involve the allocation of funds, specifically in Germany, hundreds of millions of euros, ostensibly for the purpose of reinvigorating the defense industry and turning out new weapons and new equipment. But of course, Judge, that takes a very long time on average to build a modern force, an army. It's usually about 10 years. And Germany's military establishment, particularly its army, is largely in ruins. So you're looking at a 10-year buildup. I don't frankly see that occurring. I think something well short of that will occur. But the man in charge certainly is very bellicose and makes it sound as though Germany wants war. I don't find any evidence for that with the population at all. Listen, I think the latter statement hits the nail on the head. These people want to stay in power. This is the senior class of the globalist school of political dominance that was convened years ago by George Soros. These are his products. These people are about as popular as the plague, and their populations, the electorates, want to get rid of them. The Germans are a little slower, but the French are well on the way. And Mr. Starmer is on the hit list as well. So I'm not sure that I would be too excited about these promises of massive military buildup aimed at Russia. I think it's all designed to strengthen and reinforce their authoritarian rule over the peoples of Western Europe. Well, if the Kremlin were to view various things as evidence for an act of war, they could have gone to war with us a long time ago. I think that President Putin from the very beginning has made the determination that what he wants to avoid at all cost is a war with the United States and NATO. I think the United States is currently led by someone whose speech is reckless and often not carefully considered before he opens his mouth. But given some time, he has a habit of backing off from dumb statements. I think in Europe, the statements are equally stupid and reckless, but they can't get away from it. So if you're President Putin and you understand what's been going on, your tendency at this point is to hold fire because your assumption is that things will change. I think that's true. I think in Western Europe in particular, things are going to change, and they're not going to change in ways that are going to benefit the globalist cause. And with President Trump, you get on the phone, you call him, you talk to him, and then you get a very different impression from the one that he made publicly. And we've just had this happen with the Tomahawks. He went from, oh yes, I'm going to give the Ukrainians Tomahawks. Then somebody sat him down and said, look, this is a weapon system with a 1,500-mile range. We don't have any control over where these missiles will be shot, where they will land, how much damage they'll do. But we know, based upon what we've seen of the Ukrainians, that they'll use them against civil populations and anything that produces anything of value for the people in the country. So I think that President Trump has now backed down and said, look, we want to know where these Tomahawks are going to go, and we're not sure we're going to let them do whatever they want, and so forth. In Western Europe, it's very different. I'm very concerned about the Germans releasing these Taurus missiles to the Ukrainians because That could be the proverbial Rubicon and result in Oreshnik landing in various places in Germany. The German population doesn't want that, but this man in charge is determined to do whatever he can to stay in power. One incident may be a mistake. 2 incidents are coincidence, but 3, 5, 10, this is a deliberate and targeted gray zone campaign against Europe. And Europe must respond. Russia wants to sow division. It was Italian pilots under NATO's air policing mission that escorted Russian jets from Estonian skies. Ukrainian experts are sharing frontline expertise to help member states counter drone incursions. But we must not only react, we must deter. Now the work has already begun. We are seeing the biggest surge of defense spending in the history of the Union. Now we need a precise pan-European plan coordinated very closely with NATO on how to move forward. Tackling Russia's hybrid war is not only about traditional defense, it is about software for drones, it is about spare parts for pipelines, it is about rapid cyber response teams, and it is about public information campaigns to spread awareness. We either can shy away and watch Russian threats escalate, or we meet them with unity, deterrence, and resolve. Well, that's not likely to happen. The so-called drone incursions over Poland, when we picked up the pieces of the drones that were guided into Poland, we discovered that most of them contained Polish and Swedish SIM cards. So unless the Russians are now purchasing that kind of computer guidance system from Sweden and Poland, which is clearly not the case, this was not a deliberate act by the Russians. And NATO quickly responded and said, this is not considered a threat to NATO or an incursion into NATO's space. Again, all of these alleged incidents, when you line them up and you look at them very carefully, they don't measure up to what she's trying to create, which is the illusion of a Russian interest in conflict with NATO. There's no interest at all. And that's why now Slovakia, Hungary, the Czech Republic have leaders that have said, forget it. We have no intention or any interest in going to war with Russia. And even the Polish president, who has tried to be, at least in rhetorical terms, allied with NATO, has stated, no Polish soldiers under any circumstances will cross into Ukraine and fight, pointed out that they've already lost 10,000 men fighting for Ukraine inside Ukraine. All of this is a lot of bluster and nonsense, and I don't think we should pay too much attention to it. And I think ultimately van der Leyen and the rest of these people will be removed. I think the Russians understand that preemptive attacks are always a bad idea. Bismarck said, preemptive strikes or preemptive war is essentially the same as committing suicide out of fear of death. So I think the answer is no. I think on the other hand, if Taurus missiles, which currently exist, are delivered to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians are allowed to target whatever they like, which is very dangerous because, again, we'll see those Taurus missiles land in Moscow. We'll see those Taurus missiles land in St. Petersburg, any number of different places with the objective of killing Russians and destroying Russian civilian infrastructure. If that occurs, the Russians will respond. They will use Oreshnik missiles and other hypersonic missiles to destroy German infrastructure, not civilian, but military. Frankly, no. Whatever he does, it will be at best a gesture. And that's why I sent you something that Chris Hedges read on his program, which was a leaflet from the IDF. And it made it very clear that the people in Gaza, and eventually I think on the West Bank, have a choice. They can either flee or be killed. This is the campaign of mass murder and expulsion. That's not going to change. And in fact, we've seen strikes go into Lebanon and other places since Mr. Netanyahu spoke with President Trump on the phone. I don't think President Trump has any real influence over Mr. Netanyahu. So the short answer is, I don't expect anything of real substance or value to come out of these talks. This is the very same negotiating team the Israelis tried to murder in Doha. I think the view in Hamas and probably in much of the Middle East is, whether you like it or not, you have to give it a shot. You've got to try. You've got to talk and see if anything good can come of it. And I think their expectations are very low. And I'm sure they're all watching the skies overhead, and they're very concerned about their own lives. But if they refuse to talk, they refuse to meet with the Israelis, then they will be accused of wanting this war to continue into perpetuity. So I think that's what it boils down to. You know, right now there are lots of people who want desperately to end this. I mean, the Egyptians are a good example. They're talking about bringing additional U.S. forces into the Sinai. They're hoping that we'll get between the Israelis and them. They're worried about what's happening not only in Gaza, but in Lebanon and Syria. This whole thing is explosive. It's a giant tinderbox. No one knows what will actually bring it off. And then we have Iran looming on the horizon as the next major target for Mr. Netanyahu. Before I ask you about U.S. military preparation for a war in Iran and maybe a war in Venezuela, I want to ask you about President Trump. You mentioned earlier that he says things differently in public than he says in private. Well, we all know that. He has publicly told Prime Minister Netanyahu, I'm not going to let you annex the West Bank, even though they have de facto annexed it already. And he has publicly said, now that we have an agreement in principle, stop the bombing, we have to consider the possibility that what he says in private is different, unfortunately. And I think he does know who's boss, and the boss is Netanyahu. At least insofar as events in the Middle East are concerned, President Trump is not in control. Mr. Netanyahu is in control. And I don't see any evidence that that's going to change in the short run. So I think that privately it's eminently possible he says, look, I've got a lot of people who are extremely upset about what's going on and our support for what you're doing. I have to make these statements in public. He may well have said that and Netanyahu may have nodded. We understand completely, and he's going to continue doing what he's doing regardless. That's a possibility. But right now, Mr. Netanyahu is in charge. Let's face it, those are the facts. Colonel, what military preparations is the United States making, of which you are aware, for an invasion or to support the Israeli invasion? I'm sure there's a difference, and you can tell us of Iran. Well, I don't think the Israelis are planning on invading Iran. That's very unlikely. Now, will they preposition what we would call special operators and intelligence agents in Iran? I'm sure they already have, although it's probably more difficult now than it was before. But it's still, unfortunately, surprisingly easy to buy people. And even though you execute them as traitors later on, that still is appealing to too many people. And I think that's happened in Iran and other countries in the Muslim world. Now, having said that, we are moving ammunition, we are moving weapon systems into the region, into the Eastern Mediterranean, into the Red Sea, and probably, I don't know much about the Indian Ocean. I can't comment on that, but we know those things have happened. We know that we have at least 2 batteries of theater high-altitude air defense missiles on the ground. We know that that inventory of missiles has been built up since the last round for 12 days. So I think there's a lot of evidence, yes, that in terms of people, forces, and ammunition, we're getting ready to do something in support of Israel. I don't think we're prepared to directly strike immediately, but we have to accept the high probability, if things don't go well for Israel, that we will participate. And that, of course, opens Pandora's box for all sorts of other things to come out, including the Russians, the Chinese, the Pakistanis, and so forth. I think we have to assume, based on what we saw the last time, that the Iranians can employ their entire arsenal, which they did not do in the past. That arsenal is quite capable of penetrating Israel's air and missile defenses. And I think it can also defeat much of what we have, not completely, but substantial penetration, which means $50 billion of damage the last time, perhaps $80 to $100 billion worth of damage or more this time. What the real question is, if we're right about that, and we think that the Iranian integrated air defenses are now much better than they were the last time, they may not be 100% of what the Iranians would like, but they're probably 60 to 70% of what the Iranians would like. You add that to this enormous strike arsenal, how long before the Israelis finally conclude that they cannot achieve what you just outlined? I think they're still dedicated and devoted, frankly, to this notion that they can decapitate the Iranian regime. The Iranians have already said, fine, do your worst because we have redundancy. In other words, we have people lined up to take over in the event that some of our leaders or many of our leaders are killed. What then do you do as an Israeli when you realize everything you've tried has failed? Do you turn to the use of a nuclear weapon? That's always been my greatest concern with the Israelis, because they can deliver them from the sea, from their Dolphin-class submarines were built for them by the Germans, and they don't have to necessarily fly it in. They also have missiles, but they'd have to move those much closer, obviously, to deliver them. Bottom line is, we don't know, and thus far, we've seen a lot of evidence that Mr. Netanyahu is going to do whatever the hell Mr. Netanyahu wants to do. They'll never enjoy security, and they'll constantly be at war. And then finally, and this is one of the other lessons of October 7th, because Israel has been, I don't think any of us expected Israel to still be pushing ahead with this genocidal rampage in Gaza 2 years after. Israel cannot be at peace for political reasons, not just Netanyahu, but just Israel, because it will lose its value to the US as an attack dog in the region. It will lose its value as a strategic asset to US empire if it's at peace. Like, oh no, we don't actually want to take out Iran. We're not going to fight Hezbollah. We have a Hudna. We're not actually going to keep selling weapons. Actually, our military industry is going to be reduced. Well, then we'll reduce aid to you, and you don't really matter anymore, and you're just going to shrink away into the region. So Israel, for the rest of our lives, will be engaged in this kind of war. As it expands its secret nuclear facility at Dimona, outside the purview of the IAEA, as it has been doing for the last 2 months in very aggressive fashion, as it ramps up the Samson option. I can't rule it out. I'm not going to sit here and say with absolute certainty that they will turn to a nuclear weapon to achieve their aims. But remember, this also assumes that Iran has an impact. Iran can have a devastating impact on Israel. And if the Israelis conclude that they can't protect themselves from that, they may well turn to the use of a nuclear weapon. Now, I think what he said about Dimona is absolutely correct, and I'm sure Scott Horton would agree. I would back away from some of the assumptions about the utility of Israel as the attack dog to us. I think that's overstated. Having said that, the other piece of this, and this is something you will appreciate, Judge, is that I do think that they are engaged in an eternal war for perfect security. Now, people say, well, that's ridiculous. If we go back and look at Napoleon Bonaparte and his invasion of Russia, it was essentially a search for perfect security. Bonaparte did not think he would be safe on the throne of France until he had vanquished all of his potential enemies. This is, by the way, something we can watch in any number of films about the Italian mafia. This obsession with security means you've got to destroy everyone and you trust no one around you. I think that particular mentality is very strong with the Israelis, and they think it's their God-given right in view of the Holocaust to essentially kill at will and destroy anybody, anywhere, at any time that they think is a potential threat to Israel, and that means permanent war. I think that's much stronger, frankly, in their thinking than the bit about being an attack dog for us. No, absolutely not. But there are people that think very strangely. Someone sent me a note recently and said, look what the Venezuelans did to Laken Riley. Now, I'm sure most of your audience remembers the horrible death and the injury inflicted on that girl. And this was by a criminal that had been allowed into our country by President Biden and Mr. Mayorkas from Venezuela. And I said to this person, if you're angry at what has happened because this person came from Venezuela, you need to direct your anger at Mr. Biden and Mr. Mayorkas, not at Venezuela. Well, they deliberately released people from prisons. They probably did. There's no doubt in my mind. But what probably did happen, but declaring war on the people of Venezuela, bombing them into submission, destroying that country is, in my judgment, unjustified. That's not going to win anything for us. In fact, it's going to probably be a catalyst for a larger Latin American crusade against the United States. I mean, we aren't very popular in Latin America, as you know, Judge. Anyway, we have a troubled history with the people down there. This is going to make matters infinitely worse. And now, President Trump has severed diplomatic relations, which looks like the precursor to armed action. So in that sense, no, there's no danger, direct danger from Venezuela, no danger, frankly, Judge, that we could not protect ourselves against if we guard our borders and coastal waters and pay attention to who's inside our country and deal with that problem. You know, Tulsi Gabbard has spoken to the American public and said, we have serious dangers inside the United States as a result of millions of people coming in here with agendas that we know we don't know much about them, but we know we have Islamists who've come in, various terrorists, and large numbers of criminals. Well, she's right. That's where we should focus, not on bombing another country, least of all Iran, which has certainly over the last 30 years, I would argue, well, certainly since 2001, tried very hard to find a way to repair its relations with us, right? And we shouldn't be blowing up speedboats that are 1,500 miles from our shore. Yeah, this is something interesting. I also observed that the politicians are the one really foaming at the mouth, who are the harshest warmongers these days, while often you see military leaders asking for restraint. So it's a good point that if the people who've seen war who bit more cautious, which is also why is a bit of a concern for me that the whole generation that experienced World War II has passed away, which means that the respect for the horrors of war has also diminished a bit. But it seems that in Europe that this little accountability often for the leadership, because in Germany, when the economy now is doing poor, the leadership saying, well, you know, it's Putin, it's his fault. That's why when Poland has some social upheaval, people, you know, have the wrong opinion or vote the wrong way. They say, oh, well, you know, it's Putin, he's interfering in society. So it's always, you can always point to this external boogeyman so you don't have to address your issues. But I guess just as a, quick last question, do you see that as being the key problem, that the political elite simply drifted too far away from the people they're supposed to represent? Oh, I think that's long since happened. I remember Gordon Brown, you'll recall that he was prime minister briefly, and Gordon Brown was surrounded by people. This is someplace in England. I've forgotten the location. And this woman tried to tell him about the danger of this migration. You know, we're losing control of our streets. We're being overwhelmed. And he listened and shook his head. He said, well, we'll deal with that. And as he was getting in the car, he dismissed her comments to a colleague as being racist, got in the car and drove away. Well, Gordon Brown isn't living where that lady lived. Gordon Brown is not exposed to the forces on the streets of London or Manchester or Sheffield or anywhere else that the people that live in those cities who are British are being exposed to, whether they're English or Scottish or Welsh or Irish. They are all coping with these things. Telling them that they're just racists is not a solution. And I think this is the problem at the heart of matters in much of Europe at this point. Any society, regardless of where it is, can always accept a modest number of people into its ranks who are different. And over time, modest numbers can find their way into society. In other words, they can be assimilated. But when you flood countries with millions of people who are absolutely not interested and never will be interested in assimilating, and who actually have come there with an entirely different agenda, if not to simply take over your country completely, that's something you're not going to solve by dismissing people's concerns and complaints as being racist. And I think that's a problem today in Germany, in the Netherlands, and France, and many countries. So I think there's going to be an upheaval. And I think the ruling elites that have given attention to anything and everything but their own population and the needs of their own population are going to be held accountable. What that looks like is anybody's guess, but you mentioned the French Revolution, and the French Revolution was an explosion, and that revolution did not spring up from nothing overnight. That was a long time in making. It's just that they reached a point when they could no longer buy bread in Paris that the thing exploded. But the ingredients for the explosion were always there. De Tocqueville, who wrote a marvelous book about the United States, talked about the 1848 revolution. And he was talking about he said, we in France are sleeping on the slopes of a volcano and no one is paying attention. I think we in the West are sleeping on the slopes of a volcano and the explosion is coming, but it's not an explosion directed at Russia or China or India or anybody else. It's all directed internally.